All right, so welcome to Sociology of the Family. I'm Dr. Beverly Thompson,
And I am Akello Stone.
and I'm a professor of sociology over here in Albany, New York.
And I'm an adjunct sociology professor in Los Angeles at El Camino College.
And we're friends and colleagues for a long time.
Yes.
And we both teach sociology of the family, so it just seemed really useful and exciting to kind of go over this textbook together.
And neither one of us are married or have children, so we have a unique perspective on the family.
I take an alternative families perspective in my course and enjoy talking about these non-normative families in general. In this session, we're talking about chapter 4, which is families and social class. So that's really an interesting topic because here we are talking about it during the COVID pandemic, and so there's a real concentration of wealth happening right now with these extreme rates of unemployment, people losing their jobs, but the billionaires are raking it in.
Yes. It really brings to light how interconnected families are with the larger economic health or illness of a society.
Well, I just wanted to share with you a clip because in my class, I assigned the documentary called Born Rich, which is a documentary made by Jamie Johnson from the Johnson and Johnson family.
Champagne, pretty girls. You wonder, can life get any better than this? Well, to be blunt, it can. At midnight, I'm going to inherit more money than most people could earn or spend in a lifetime. I live in a country that everyone wants to believe is a meritocracy. I guess if it makes you feel better, keep telling yourself that. It doesn't work for me anymore. I know my family gives away millions of dollars each year to charity, but how does that exactly level the playing field? I mean, what did I do to earn the kind of money I'll own at midnight tonight? All I did was inherit it.
You know, we have this meritocracy kind of perspective in our society that everyone, the American dream, if you work hard, you can achieve it. But right in the introductory section, this chapter is saying it's really based on what you're born into that predicts where you end up.
And you know what I always like to say when we talk about, like, we want to make a sweeping statement about social class, social stratification, the class system, the rich, the poor, the middle class, is not everybody will ever be able to have that kind of wealth. The system is designed and through the educational tracking and through other forms of social control, the system is designed to ensure that there are people at the bottom, right, that are going to never be able to have the kind of freedom and the kind of power, both intellectual power, political power. And so I think that by having, the Trumps mentioned in this book, it's very interesting because I think a lot of people, they don't realize that in some upper echelons of governmental leadership is people have come from money. Mm-hmm. They have been groomed their whole life to take this, to have, because I mean, if I was to run for office and they were to vet me, oh my God, the things that they would find, I would never make it. But because if you've never had to struggle, like he was saying, he's never had to struggle. But and in the same sense is, if I were in the same shoes, my perspective about life would be completely different than it is having been born into a blue collar family, right? It would be completely different, and I would be a completely different person.
Yeah, and that's what the chapter's about. So let's get into it with some of these terms and ideas, because that is the point, is just how your social class directs your, I mean, they mentioned social capital and stuff later on, but just your whole perspective, your whole, how you live your life, these microcosms in your daily life.
Well, there were actually two perspectives on class, on looking at the class structure. There's a visual representation that shows people climbing up this ladder, and then other people are in these categories or boxes. And when I looked at that, I was trying to understand, like, what is the most meaningful aspect of that, at least from my interpretation. And it is, the ladder system is, if I'm climbing a ladder, I'm the same person at the bottom of the ladder as I am moving up. I'm just higher up. However, the common set of circumstances and perspectives, regardless of if you move into a different social class, and of course, you could move up or down in social class depending upon larger circumstances that you don't have control over, but you are going to have a different perspective than someone that was always in a particular class. And there's some reproduction that happens, and there's also the crabs in a barrel analogy, if you're familiar with that. And I've seen that before. I've seen that in my family. I've had people tell me their experiences with that if you are born in a particular class, let's say you're in the working class and you go to college and, you know what I mean, you're the only one, first generation, there's going to be an alienation that happens between you and your family members, because the way that they see themselves is, and then the way they see you, even though you're the same person, they can't reconcile that. And so, because I was always the person was like, are you still in school? Are you still in college? You're still in school? You know what I mean? And that's what I got. That's my congratulations or whatever. It's like, you're still in school. Are you ever going to work? I'm like, I am working too.
Right. And that's what's frustrating, is that people have the same potential and abilities and intelligence potential and all that, but the resources are just more important. And so you can be, poor working class and be so smart, but you can only get so far. And on the flip side, you can be really rich and not very smart and go very far.
Yes. Yeah. So it's almost like intellectual capital is, well, here's the thing is with social class. And I wrote down, when I was reading, is the whole idea of the stigma of being working class or part of the lower class or underclass. There's a stigma attached to that. And the stigma is saying to people that a person who is poor is not as smart as someone who is wealthy, and completely, abandon any idea that, like, what people have access to.
Everything gets reduced to dollar signs because we live in a capitalist economy. And so just everything is measured based on dollar value. And there's not really another value that we have in our society. So the first question you ask someone, what do you do? Good to meet you. What do you do? It's the first thing you want to ask, rather than what are you passionate about? What are you excited about? Or who's your family? Or where do you come from? What part of the country, or what neighborhood, what tribe?
Well, let's go back to that question that is posed, right? What do you think that person, because I always believe when people ask questions, it's not just, I want some information. It's, I want to place some idea of who they think you are. And so what kind of things do you think they can determine if you told them what you did for a living?
Well, we're instantly trying to categorize people upon meeting each other. So based on your appearance and the context in which we meet. But just, your category of employment is a master status is a logical term that we've used. And so usually your occupation becomes a master status, and a master status is something that a person is reduced to some label that you can attach to yourself, like this X person, like this professor, whatever, profession or race or gender or what have you.
The other thing that I think about when someone asks, what do you do? They want to figure out how much money I make. They want to look where that job might fall, like in prestige, right? So we got wealth, we got, Weber's multidimensional model of social class placement, those three cylinders, wealth, prestige, and power, based on an occupation. And also, I believe there's also this infusion of a value orientation about what you do. You know, like what is your moral compass like as a result of your occupation? You know, how valuable are you to society? And people kind of want to know that. I feel like they're trying to figure that out, and how smart you are, and just, you know what I mean? There's so much more to a person. That's the thing about when you start talking about social class in a capitalist society, as you had mentioned, there's just so much emphasis on work, right? And there's so much more to people than that, you know? So when we talk about these things, while it is important, we also have to make sure that this is not like the totality of a person, you know? I don't believe in master status period. I think master status is a simplification of the complexity of multidimensional nature of human identity.
Well, in the section on generations of wealth and privilege, they start to get into how people marry within their class, and furthermore, we can say that people marry within their race, within, you know, all kinds of categories, their religion, and so on. And then when you don't, there might be some static, and especially from the families. If we think about Stephanie Kuntz, you know, the historian of marriage, who talks about how marriage historically is just to unite two so maybe wealthy families, you know, it's bringing families together, appropriate families. It's not about love. And she says that contemporary love relationships is really to the historic people who view that the marriage as uniting families of aligned classes. Love can undermine that, because people can randomly fall in love with the wrong person. But it's
one way that you prevent that from happening, though, and pardon my interruption, but I didn't want to forget because you were making a good point, is one way that you maintain that is you restrict interaction.
Right.
That's why we have things like country clubs and whatnot.
If you think about, I mean, wealthy people live in a very small bubble, you know, they're very controlled because they have to interact with the right people. They have to do what their parents and their family say. They can't bring shame upon their family. They need to marry the right person that their family approves of. And probably if they have money, it's a lot of strings attached to it, you know, like they're going to be told how to live their life according to their family.
Yes.
And so this chapter in this section talks about how people, you know, they meet at college, they go to the same levels of college, they marry people within the same kind of professional status, and so on. And that, you know, in a different place, they mentioned, you know, the Cinderella story, that a rich man would fall in love with a poor woman, and just that kind of social, that idea out in society that, oh, marry a rich man, you know. And so this sociologist was making the statement that's not going to happen. You know, the rich man has to marry a rich woman to just keep the family wealth intact. And so they do, in this textbook, they had a diagram of just a family and who they marry, and that they basically marry people of their same status.
Yeah, and I think you also made a really good point when you talk about, you know, what kind of person are you, you know, based upon the expectations that have been drilled into you. And there's probably always this raising of the wealthy, and even though there's, you know, you can segregate wealthy people so they're only interacting with wealthy people, right? But there will be times when there's some cross-class interaction, if you will, and they probably have already prepared their children for that, to let them give them the idea that there's someone always, that people have less than you are always going to want what you have, you know. So people, the whole idea, it's almost like when I think about marriage, you know, in when it's not endogamous, right, on a social class perspective, or even occupation, there are some people who will not marry someone who makes far less money than them.
Right.
Even if, like you said, even if they love them, marriage is still not the
Especially
same.
a woman to a man. If a woman makes more money than a man, then
Yes.
that can create some static because it's going against these gendered expectations.
Absolutely. It's going against the gendered expectation. And there's also this inherent idea that men hold that we must make more money than women. You know,
Think about the stigma of stay-at-home dads. I mean, my students mentioned that example, you know.
Yeah, it's like a stay-at-home dad, I think, is wonderful. And other people, it's like he cut his balls off, right?
He's a failure,
like
an economic failure.
Demasculinated.
Because a part of manhood is to be a provider.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
That's the central identity. And so it's interesting, like just the gender dynamic, because especially men are judged by their profession historically, and even some outdated sociology textbooks one might read talks about the male, profession. They're not even thinking about women. Of course, nowadays women are in a lot of professions. There's still a lot of segregation there.
Yeah.
But men especially have their attachment to value based on their job. And so when men are unemployed, it really hits them emotionally. So in the American class structure section, it's interesting because on one hand, sociologists need to be specific in how you measure a class. Like, is it income? Is it a combination of 10 different things? Like, how do you measure these classes? So you have the definition, first of all. But second of all, you have the social class identity. And so in this graph, they're talking about how people identify with a social class, which may or may not correlate with what class they actually fit in as far as a sociologist would define. And so, because we think about American culture, we think, oh, everyone's going to identify as the middle class. But we see here actually working class with 47%.
Yeah. And it's interesting when I see the working class and the middle class next to each other. There could be some back and forth movement between those. There could be back and forth movement between any of these groups. But because you have the largest concentration in this area is, because of instability, right? Because one of the things is less stability in the working class than the middle class. So while there are some working class occupations who could actually make more money hourly than the middle class, there's greater stability in the middle class long term. And we see this playing out right now during, who is being impacted the most in terms of employment, and it is the working class. Who are directly linked, and there's obviously people in the middle class that are affected, but I know people who actually are benefiting significantly from remote work. They're making the same salary. The workload is definitely less because when people are not in your face all the time, or that kind of thing, it's just, if the workload is different, you can spread it out throughout the day, and it's just like, this is cool. I'm still, and the other people are just scrambling to find work just to make it paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah. And you pointing that out, that there's, of course, it's hard to distinguish between the working class and the middle class. And that just points to the fact that these are social, these are created categories, they're not and so that also implies why we need to have a very multifaceted, multidimensional aspect to understanding class, because it can't just be income, for example, because like you said, a plumber or someone working in a factory might be making more money than your college professor.
Right.
But there's still this, distinction between that. The plumber is still considered working class, even though he might be making, or she might be making, $100,000 a year.
Right. And that's where the stability factor comes in, because if there's no work, then you lose, if your livelihood is based upon project by project by project. It's very much living in LA, very much in the acting world. if acting jobs that you rely on to make an income are not happening because of larger forces, you're just SOL. You're out of luck. You know what? Also, when I thought about this, and I've never talked to anyone about this because it just kind of came to mind now and the way to frame the question. But if someone, let's say someone came over for a dinner party and they brought a bottle of wine, right? In my mind, I would say that's a very classy thing to do. But then when I kind of think about it, am I referring to class, social class?
Mhm.
Or, I don't know, I've never really investigated the linguistic term, but I might even be saying that, that there's a certain decorum and there's a way, but actually they did talk about that in the chapter. They talked about, when we get to the parenting part, they talk about,
Mhm.
if you have the skills to interact with people and self-advocacy and, being able to dialogue and interact with professionals, when you're young, and then as you get older, that does put you at an advantage. There's certain things that people do
Right.
that puts them at an advantage, regardless, because no one's going to say, hey, what class are you? What social class are you in, right? So that's where the occupation thing comes in. But
Right.
again, it's also what behaviors, perspectives do you enact your everyday life with?
Right. That's the social capital concept.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so we don't even think about it, but we know it inherently. But that's what sociology talks about, are these things that we live, like the air we breathe, but we don't really recognize them. And so
yeah,
social capital can be things like how you speak, how
yes,
you dress, how you interact with people. Do you make eye contact or not? Um,
yeah,
your health care regimen, your dental care,
yes,
whether you had braces as a child. And we're judging people on these little things, and we're judging what kind of social class they have. But the things like the books that you have in the house, or just how you decorate your house. And you mentioned the wine, versus like a six pack of beer, and what kind of beer, and all
right,
what television shows you watch. Like everything can be
yes,
tied into these. Well, that's called the sociology concept of like distinction, taste, and
yeah.
so on.
That's like high culture. That's kind of that kind of, but it also, what it makes me think about too, and as it relates to social mobility, like upward social mobility. If you came from lower class, but you're that person and you work, you just get yourself through this system,
Right.
and you're not quite accepted because on this side, because you have a different relationship to money, you have a different relationship to, you know, for example, if you grew up and, they were talking about in the book, they were talking about the idea of, the program, SNAP,
Hmm.
the idea of someone, here's like $4 to $5 a day to eat on, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are just going to order and they don't look at the price. If you've always shop by price and make your determinations when you go into the department store. Have you ever said, oh God, I love this jacket, and then you look at the price tag, you're like, no way, right? And
Right.
if you start to make more money, I feel like you're still going to have that.
Right.
You're still gonna be very conscious of money. I don't know if you can ever completely
Right.
let that go, because we have a relationship to money based upon how we were raised and what our how we were tracked in school. There's tracking in school that I didn't even know was happening.
My dad grew up in the Depression era.
Uh,
He's 93 years old in
uh,
Nebraska. His grandparents, he lived as an infant on his grandparents' farm. They lost the farms during the Depression
mm,
in Nebraska. And he saw his uncle, working in the state work program, building, the roads. And that marked him for life. And so you can tell that he is a Depression era child. and he cannot spend money. And so, if we go to a restaurant nowadays, he cannot comprehend how much a meal costs. So if I go out to a meal with him, I'm going to order the cheapest thing on the menu because his head will explode if he how much a meal costs now.
It just never goes away, though, does it?
And he says things like, when I was a boy, ice cream for 5 cents, I can't take my dad out and have him spend $10 on an ice cream cone.
Yeah.
It makes people feel
mentality.
uncomfortable,
Yeah. I immediately thought of the film Trading Places with Eddie Murphy, a social experiment that they did, But I was like, wow, I wonder what that would be like, though, someone who's really wealthy, just to have it all taken away. Like, what would they learn from that after 5 years,
Yeah.
I don't know. Or could they ever I think it would probably it would be pretty hard for them to deal with that if they've never had to deal with that.
Well, social experiment can be, reflecting on a time we've experienced where we're trying to fit in to a different social class, or we're in a context that's unfamiliar. You talk about upward mobility or downward mobility. A lot of wealthy people who go to college might be kind of hiding their wealth and trying to just fit in and not draw attention to themselves. Also. And we can tell this, like we hear about, first generation folks going into college or becoming professors and stuff like that. And so then you can really notice the inherent upper middle class structure that is in academia, the expectation that you have this kind of background and this kind of familiarity. For example, when you first become a professor, you might have to take a job that does not pay a living wage, to say the least. And so if you have some family money to rely on, then that'll really help you through that initial.
I just always, I say this in my mind, and this is like one of those things where cannot be changed, but I just wondered, what could my life have been like if I didn't have to worry about money along the way? What kind of experiences would I have had and people I would have met, we can't do that. We can't go back and wish things were different. But what we can do is really, look at the bigger picture, and how much of that system are we buying into as it relates to our identity? And I mean, I'm guilty for it too. Like if I tell someone that, I'm from a blue collar, I was raised blue collar. That's how I know how to do like carpentry and fix stuff. And I was the kid that, I had to do all the lawn maintenance for all the ants and stuff, and then get paid to do that and deliver papers and stuff like that. I've been working since, the 4th grade, if you really want to be honest. And I was raised to believe that's what your purpose on life is, just to work and make money, even if it's a little money. It's more than you're making if there's never anything about, I worked on an onion farm for $1.50 an hour, crawling around weeding onions. I swear to God, that sounds unbelievable. When I was in college in the 90s, they paid a student wage, which was $2.85 an hour, which was 50 cents less than, the minimum wage, which was $3.35. So I learned early on, how do you supplement your income? And it was by doing illegal things, under the table things,
The table. And that's another indicator of just, especially for men, to measure their social capital. You have men that are handy and have these kind of skills, like you mentioned, carpentry skills. Yes. And there's men that have none of these skills.
Yes. And so the men that have none of those skills, all in my mind is things it's like, they're going to have to pay somebody to do everything for the rest of their life. But see, it still comes down to money.
So on page 130, they talk about increasing inequality, which is very applicable to our contemporary issue of going through the pandemic, where so many millions of people have lost their jobs, and then X number have regained their jobs, but we're still at a huge, huge deficit. And then at the same time, the millionaires and billionaires are really raking it in. And so we see this division between Main Street and Wall Street, that they're really just in two different worlds. And, you know, Robert Reich in his documentary Inequality for All really goes into detail about how this inequality came about by policy.
Of all developed nations, the United States has the most unequal distribution of income, and we're surging toward even greater inequality. 1928 and 2007 become the peak years for income concentration. It looks like a suspension bridge.
Last year we made $36,000.
I probably make $50,000 a year, working 70 hours a week.
The middle class is struggling. Now, people occasionally say to me, what nation does it better? The answer is the United States. In the decades after World War II, the economy boomed, but you had very low inequality.
Do you know Robert Reich? I do, and he's a communist.
When I was a kid, bigger boys would pick on me. I think it changed my life. I had to protect people from the people who would beat them up economically. Who is actually looking out for the American worker? The answer is nobody.
That makes a good point, just that folks living in poverty pay more for basically everything.
And I was like, it's like, why would you give the poorest person who's trying to establish credit a 21% credit card, and then you see the commercial for is like 0 interest on approved credit? I'm like, who's getting 0 interest from a car? A rich person. So if you were to make, I always say it like this, let's say you were to make $1,000 more a month as a result of going to college, and of that $1,000, you pay $300 for student loans, which still sucks, but you still are you still have $700 more that you're making a month, Like my thing is, by all means necessary if you have to advance yourself. And that's what does happen. That's another one of those cultural reproduction things, to avoid loans, and even though if it's necessary, like getting books, for example. I don't know if you have students who, they don't buy the book. If you've ever had a student who don't buy the textbook, that's going to really put you at a disadvantage by not having the textbook, And I know they're costly, but there's another barrier, another obstacle.
Students are at different levels, and so even at the same school, of course.
Yeah.
But, for my school, at a private school, some students, mention that their parents are paying for their entire tuition. There's a lot of athletes that get a free ride. And then there's students that are coming out of college with almost $100,000 in debt. And so right out of the gate, out of, getting your bachelor's degree, they're set up instantly on these different economic situations. And then that kind of student loan debt is something that you might never get out of your whole life. You're just going to be making this payment forever. You
are, and that is, that is an intentional strategy to maintain, these social classes.
Think about financial literacy. Our society doesn't want us to be financially literate. Take classes in college about financial literacy.
Right.
Because of these predatory lending companies that feed off of our ignorance.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And there we go again, though. Like, the idea of someone coming from a family that's amassed so much transgenerational wealth that they could live on the interest of their investments. They never, touch that principal pool. There's enough interest coming in, and now he's like, I always ask my classes, we got a savings account? How much interest have you earned on that savings account? And how long could you live on that? And like some people would be like, they couldn't even get a Starbucks coffee.
$2, right?
I was like, whoa, what is life like, But it is a barrier. These are obstacles that continue to present themselves, and the way that they, if I can flow into this idea of the poverty line.
Yes, please.
The poverty line is it's interesting. If you've ever seen the numbers, I pulled some of the numbers up. According to the poverty line is calculated by how much would it cost to have a survival diet per day, you know, and then you multiply that by 3, and that's what the poverty line is. But most people are paying more than half their income for housing costs.
So of course, this poverty line is far, far, far below the reality of what poverty is. But that points to the important perspective that this is very political, because why would we not want to put the poverty line at a realistic level? And it's because
Absolutely.
the numbers would just jump so high. And so politicians would be very upset to state the fact that many Americans are just living in quite impoverished manner.
There are 3 things that are mentioned. I think they're important to mention. First, it says there's 3 problems, like you said, with the measure. The price of food has risen more slowly than the price of housing and medical care. If you are sick, you are not going to be able to work. And if you do work, you're not going to be able to be effective. If you are sick, your life will be much shorter. You know, if you had a certain amount of income, you want to meet your basic necessities first. And some people don't even have utilities. You know, some people don't even have heat in their home. Says the calculation doesn't include important government benefits that some low-income families get, and those benefits are so small. And finally, it does not take into account the different cost of living in different places. And again, living in one of the most expensive places in the nation is like, when I saw the poverty line, you know, calculation for a person of 1, it's 12,000. Like, what could a person of 1? And again, this is the gross salary. This is not after they take the taxes out.
Yeah,
So,
LA compared to Albany, New York, quite different. The same poverty line, but very different factors. And mentioning medical charges, I mean, you're talking about someone maintaining their health, but if you have one medical disaster, that can just bankrupt you for life.
You know, kids going to school provides childcare during that time, and it provides meals.
So a lot of investment goes into, you know, people and their human capital and their futures. And so if you're rich, then we just don't consider the money that your family gave you as welfare. But if it's coming from the state,
it is though.
then we stigmatize that. But all of us need help getting, you know, achieving these things. And so if you don't have that family paying your tuition and taking care of all your expenses, then how is it going to happen?
You know, so obviously poverty is impacted by race. It's impacted by family structure. A single parent home, mostly headed by women who get paid significantly less and then have to dole out for childcare, can increase, you know, the poverty rate. It can increase the other thing that I think that is important. And obviously, it's not sociological, but it's the sociological impact on mental health and depression.
Right.
And that doesn't just go away because you get a good job. You know what I mean? That manifests itself. The worry of being able to meet your basic necessities.
But in the chapter, they had these charts, and you mentioned just the composition of the family. And so they really point out, you know, categories: unmarried, female-headed families, unrelated individuals living together, married couple families, and unmarried male-headed families. And so we can really see that the important aspect of a family and money is the man and the married couple, and they have a little image there with a man and woman, so they're implying a heterosexual married couple, you know, is the least impoverished family formation. And then, of course, unmarried female-headed families are the highest. And then we might even, you know, talk about LGBT marriage, because if you have 2 white men together in a family formation compared to, you know, 2 lesbians together, then they're also going to have quite a distinct class outcome as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Page 140, I think this is an illuminating statement. Almost 1 in 6 Americans do not have the income necessary to support their basic needs. That's a sobering fact, you know, and Then we talk about eviction. There's a stigma of being evicted. If you're evicted, it's very difficult to get additional housing,
Right.
and then becomes a lack of housing. And then there's, it says these experiences, like the being evicted and having to move around a lot and forced to move, these experiences are stressful for parents and disruptive for families.
That brings us to the family practices section, where it is talking about basically parenting practices, but developing social capital in the children.
Yes.
And how they have this one distinction where they talk about middle class parents practice what they call concerted cultivation. And then they say working class and poor parents practice the accomplishment of natural growth. And so these are two sociological concepts and terms to talk about these different childhoods, where concerted cultivation is where you go to a lot of activities that cost money, and you have your ballerina practice and your all kinds of your sports and your tennis and your horse riding lessons and your camps. And then working class and poor parents practice the accomplishment of natural growth, which means kind of just free range childhood.
So if you started from the very beginning with a disadvantage, it doesn't just go away like, oh, I have a degree now. All that disadvantage is still compounded, and it's still going to create obstacles all along the way. Some people don't even know how to label their class. They don't even think about it, you know what I mean? But I think it's important to not only think about where you would fall in this system, but also be cognizant of where other people fall in the system, and understand that opportunity, that we can, as individuals, we can change the outcomes for other people in really small ways. And I think that's one of the most fulfilling aspects of my role, because I was like, I'm going to go to higher ed. I'm going to teach for 10 years, I'm going to give back, and then I'm going to do something else. But there was just, I felt like there was so much more I could offer being a person. Like on this chart, neither of my parents got a high school diploma. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like I could be like, yeah, it is possible. It is possible. Don't let that limit you.
Historically, it was possible more so in the 70s. We saw, that's the peak really for equality in this country.
Yeah.
And it's been downhill since there. So previous generations and historically there was upward mobility, and that's what we look to when we say that it's still possible today, when really it's less so.
And
it is frustrating, because as sociologists, it's like we know this stuff, but that doesn't help you get outside of it. Like, we're still in the situation, even though we understand what's happening.
I mean, I was one of those people that was like, education can transform people in society. Like, it's all you need is education. And so I work, you know what I mean? And then, I'm like in that adjunct pool, I'm underemployed and things like that, so it is not a guarantee. A college degree is not a guarantee, and if you do not have those networks and you do not have that advantage, work your butt off and get an internship, because that's the other thing about internships is you get an
exploited labor.
That
exploited labor interns. That's another issue too, of who can afford to take an unpaid internship and who can't.
Exactly. No, I mean, I hear you. You're going to have to work and do an internship, even if it's like 2 days a week. I'm just saying, if you do not have a means to get into these places, you got to find a means. And it always turns out to like you having to work harder, you being at a disadvantage, That's
another thing we have to teach our students to do is, this idea of like branding yourself or just building your own situation.
Yeah.
And developing those skills, and you can look up things on YouTube, but
and people have to learn how to just continue to record their achievements and not let them just dribble away, you know, like every time, like if someone like with, like in my class, when they do those YouTube videos, like I don't want them just to do the YouTube video and then show the class and then delete it. I'm like, no, this is your entree into this method of, you know, showing your ability to express and communicate. And somewhere down the line, it's going to be helpful, especially if you continue to develop and get better. You know, the thing is you have to be ahead of the pack on certain things.
So the bachelor's is just the beginning, and you really gotta,
yeah,
you know, make it happen. You gotta put a lot more effort into it in these neoliberal times. It's rough, and people really need to work everything they can.
They refer to society as like a win or lose society. And when I think of degrees, even though I gained a lot because I learned how to think and just all that, right? Which a lot of people don't really value. But I tell people, though, it is a pay to play. You know, anything that you do, you have to pay to play. Like if you want to be an actor, you got to pay for headshots, and you got to pay for like 3 or 4 different casting things. And, you know, you have to pay to play, and you're paying into the system that basically says, and I'm willing to make this commitment, you know, to getting this degree. And if I can make this commitment to getting this degree, even though I got to pay for it, I can make a commitment to your office. And I'll probably have to buy new clothes and things like that. You know, the expenses that you have to have then in order to be able to be, you know, in the workplace in the right way. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Dr. Thompson.
And that's chapter 4.
And that's chapter 4.